although the book of Esther is a historical book, it reads like a short story. In fact, all the elements of a short story are there, and we're going to use that as our outline tonight. So number one, we'll see the characters and the setting. And then secondly, we'll look at the plot and the conflict. And then lastly, we'll look at the theme. All right, so that's going to be the outline tonight. We are going to read a lot. All right, so I want you to know that ahead of time. We're going to cover a significant portion of the book. And so if you like to follow along, I'll be reading out of the English Standard Version. If you do not have a copy, there is one in front of you there. So that may be helpful for you if you just like to. We're going to read a good portion of the book together this evening. And although it's beautifully written, we do not know exactly who wrote it. Tradition says perhaps Mordecai, maybe Ezra or Nehemiah. But the reality is we don't know with any certainty who wrote the book. We do know it's someone who would have been very familiar with the ins and out of the Persian government, particularly what was taking place in Susa, the capital. They would have been well informed on what was taking place within the palace. And so this is someone who reminding you that the book of Esther is taking place post-exile, right? What I mean is this. There was a 70-year period of exile under Babylon. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and under Cyrus the Great, the Jews were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. They did not all go back to Jerusalem. We'll see that as we get into the book. One of the interesting things, a couple unique things about the book, it's named after a woman. There's only 2 books in all of the Scripture that's named after a woman. The other one we've already looked at, which is the book of Ruth, which is that incredible story of redemption. The book of Esther really centers around the theme of the sovereignty of God. And what's unique about that, and really unique of all the books in all of Scripture, is the name of God is never mentioned. Not one time in the book of Esther does the name of God come up. And that's unique. In fact, some people have questioned whether the book of Esther belongs in the Scripture because of the lack of the presence of God's name. But the reality is that his hands are all over the book, even though his name is not. So let's get into it together. Esther chapter 1, verse 1 will help us with the setting, the background here. It is a historical book, and so we need some historical background. So in verse 1, it says, "Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his throne, his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him." And this king Ahasuerus is the ruler of the mighty Persian Empire. He would have ruled for about 21 years before he was assassinated. To put it in perspective, he ruled from 486 BC to 465 BC. He is the grandson of Cyrus the Great, who was the first ruler there of Persia who overcame the Babylonians. He's the son of Darius. So these are familiar names. You perhaps know him better as Xerxes. That's his Greek name, and if I have opportunity, I'd prefer to say that as opposed to Ahasuerus, and so we may do that as we're reading. Just know that that's the same man, all right? King Xerxes, who was a mighty, powerful, would have been the most powerful man in the world at that time. And so the book of Esther is going to fall within his rule and reign. In fact, the time period we're going to see is about a 10-year period of his rule, occurring early on in his reign. It's going to happen, just for perspective here, because we looked at Ezra and Nehemiah. The book of Esther is going to fall in between those periods. Remember, there was that Cyrus turned the Jews loose to go back to Jerusalem, right? And so with that first group under Zerubbabel, they returned in about 538. So there was a group that went back, and then there's a group that went back with Ezra, the second group coming back. in between those two groups returning to Jerusalem, the events of Esther is going to happen. And the interesting thing is this. Although the Jews were allowed to go and return to Jerusalem, many of them did not. And so you ask the question, well, what happened with them? And so the book of Esther helps us with that question. What happened to the Jews who stayed, who did not return to Jerusalem? The reality is they were disobedient. They should have went back to Jerusalem. They should have went back to the promised land, but they stayed, probably for many reasons. I'm sure they assimilated to life in Babylon, in the Persian kingdom. They had businesses, they had families, they had roots there, and they did not uproot to go back to the land that God had given them. And so we find this people here dwelling in Persia, under Persian rulership, even though they were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. In the first chapter, really, it's a big feast. It's a big party. Xerxes is going to throw a 7-day lavish feast. Right? And I want you just to imagine all the greatest party you can imagine. This is a man who had all the resources at his disposal, and he's going to use every bit of it to show his kingdom off. Right? There is no limits. Right? There is gold everywhere. There is food everywhere. It's open bar. As you're reading the first chapter here, literally he says they can have as much as they want to drink. There's no limit. And they do. For 7 days, they party. And really, this is a party to celebrate a victory that's never going to happen. Xerxes is going to try to avenge the loss, the defeat of his father Darius against the Greek Empire. Right? Darius tried to overtake the Greeks on numerous occasions, failed to do so, and Xerxes says, you know what my dad couldn't do, I'm going to do, and he's going to celebrate that victory beforehand. Probably goes before a fall, right? So that's your spoiler. It doesn't work. But this is his pre-victory celebration. And during this 7 weeks, Xerxes himself gets drunk, right? And in his drunkenness, he invites his wife, Vashti, out to show her off before all of his guests, right? Now, Queen Vashti says, I'm not coming out. I'm not going to take part in this, right? And we don't know exactly why. We don't know what he wanted her to do, but I'm sure she was concerned for her dignity in this situation. And she says no. Now, this is the most powerful man in the world. And she says no. Well, that doesn't sit well with the king. And so he asked all of his advisors and his wise men, what do I do? And all of his wise men and advisors say, well, you can't let her get away with it. She can't be queen anymore. Put her away. And he does exactly that. And that's what you see unfolding there in chapter 1. We see the end of Queen Vashti, and they have a new plan. We see in chapter 2 here, all right, in chapter 2 it says, after these things, a 2-year period goes by where he just dismisses. There's no queen in Persia. All right. What's happening during that 2 years? The attack on Greece, right? The pre-party celebration didn't pan out so well. Xerxes puts all of his effort, one of the largest armies in history, takes it to Greece, and he fails, and he comes home. And when he comes home, it says what? When the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, to the citadel, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. Essentially, their advice was, have a beauty contest, right? And the woman who wins the beauty contest will be the new queen. And so that's exactly what Xerxes is going to do. Right, now we're going to be introduced to the primary characters here in chapter 2. So don't miss here. In verse 5 it says, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. That's significant. who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, right? That's her Hebrew name, which is Esther, which is her Persian name, all right? So the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Right? So we get introduced to Mordecai and Esther. Right? Mordecai is Esther's cousin. And Esther's parents die. She's an orphan, and Mordecai is going to adopt her. It says he takes her into his family as his own. And I got excited when I read about that. Right? Here's this young orphan girl who's brought into the house of Mordecai, and God is going to use her greatly. The girls were sitting at lunch today with Jacelyn, and they said, "Jacelyn, what do you want to be when you grow up?" And she said, "A princess." You giggle, right? We giggled. We laughed. But that's exactly what happens to Esther in our story, right? She's an orphan girl who's going to grow up to be a princess. God is going to use this little girl named Esther to accomplish great things. So as we continue to read in verse 8, it says, "So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made it known, and every day Esther had not made known her people or kindred, nor for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her." Now, what you see is her growing in favor, right? First of all, with the one who is over the harem of Xerxes. And what's happening here is these young women that were chosen to participate in the beauty contest are going to go through a preparation for 1 year. They're going to be prepared to go before the king. Right? And I find that interesting, right? Because what's happening here is this man, this most powerful man on earth, is preparing these women for himself. In the meantime, the King of Kings is preparing this young woman to accomplish something for his kingdom. And I think it's important here that we see that we have some graduates here tonight. Right? God is preparing you. Right? I mean, you've been prepared by the school, and you've been prepared by your parents, but in the meantime, the King of Kings is at work in your life, preparing you for something for his kingdom. And I don't want you to miss that, right? We see the hand of God flowing throughout the book here. And in fact, if I was going to liken the book of Esther to anything, I would liken it to the account of Joseph in Genesis. You see the hand of God on Joseph ends up, he's done a raw deal, right? And yet God is continually showing his grace towards Joseph. And we see the same thing happening here with Esther. Now, if we come to the end of chapter 2, let's go to verse 19, right? So Esther's growing in favor, in fact, to the point where Xerxes says, she's the one, right? Esther is going to be my new queen. She's going to replace Vashti. God's hand is upon this woman. She becomes the new queen. In verse 19, we have kind of a plot here. We kind of begin to see something happening. So it says, "Now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her." Why do you think he did that? Why do you think he said, "Don't tell anybody you're Jewish"? They hated the Jews, right? There was anti-Semitism that was very strong in the kingdom. Said, "Don't tell anybody." And so she doesn't. She keeps it quiet. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, 2 of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So you need to put a pin in that, right? Mordecai hears of this plot against the king's life, and he makes it known, and they make note of it. They don't do anything at that point, right? I mean, if you save the king's life, something should happen, right? Nothing happens except for they just say, hey, let's write this down. And that's what they do. They write down what Mordecai has done. Now, I told you that later on, Xerxes is going to die of assassination, right? So here's an assassination attempt, and it really brings to light, we read Nehemiah last week as the cupbearer, how serious that job was to be the cupbearer to the king. People were constantly trying to kill the king, right? And so that's what was happening here. Right? Now, in chapter 3, we're going to get the major conflict that we see in the book. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Now, right, we have a new character on the scene, this man named Haman, and he's an Agagite. Now, you might say, well, that means nothing to me. I told you to make note. Mordecai's a Benjaminite. Right? Haman's an Agagite. You say, what? This is going to go back, right? I mean, this is like the Hatfield and the McCoy kind of thing. Right? It goes back almost 1,000 years to when the Israelites came out of exile, and the Amalekites tried to wipe the Israelites out. And God protected them. In fact, God put a curse on the Amalekites and said, we're going to wipe out that entire nation. And if you'll remember in 1 Samuel chapter 15, King Saul attacked the Amalekites, defeated the Amalekites, and was supposed to kill them all, but he did not kill the king. The king's name was Agag. Right? Haman's an Agagite. Right? He's from the line of King Agag. Now, here's what happens. Saul disobeys God. God says, Saul, I'm done with you. I got a new king in line. The prophet Samuel steps in. If you want to read about this, you can. Samuel takes Agag and literally chops him in pieces. Right? He says, I'm going to do what you should have done. Right? And so Haman doesn't have much regard for the Jewish people because they had taken his, this is about 500 years earlier, so this is a long-standing feud between the Benjaminites, Saul, right, and the Agagites. So Haman is elevated to this place of prominence in the kingdom, and he says, you know what? You need to bow down to me. And Mordecai says, I'm not having any of that. And he refuses to bow down. And you can imagine how that's received, right? Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Did you catch that? Haman says, I don't want simply Mordecai. I want to kill all of the Jews. And so this is his plan. And his plot is to eliminate all the Jewish people. Now, he comes up with a plan. In fact, his plan it centers around the rolling of some dice. They call it they call it Purim, and it's casting lots. And he's going to cast lots. And he's going to come up with a date, and he says, on this date, we're going to eliminate all of the Jews. He goes before Xerxes. He says, there's these people in the land. They don't obey your laws. They don't honor you as the king. They're a threat. And Xerxes says, Haman, do what you want to do. And so Haman writes a law with the ring of Xerxes. It's an unchangeable law and says, on this day, all the Jews are going to die. Well, the word spreads throughout the kingdom. In fact, when you finish chapter 3, Verse 14, a copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Everybody's going, what in the world is going on? Everybody else in the kingdom who's not a Jew has just been given orders to kill the Jews on a certain day. And the Jews, you can imagine, are terrified. And that's what we see in chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth. But he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Right? So it's clear here what happens, right? Esther sees her cousin who raised her mourning out in the gate, and she says, what is wrong? What's happened? Why are you so upset? She sends a messenger. The messenger says, Esther, Mordecai says they're going to kill all of your entire family. Right? They're going to kill them all. And he's asking you to speak on behalf of your people to the king. And Esther says, you know what? If I go into the king without permission, he's going to kill me. Remember, I mean, this is a man who, because his wife said no, said, you're done, right? And now, Mordecai is saying, Esther, I want you to go to the king on our behalf. She said, I can't do it. So here's what happens. Verse 13, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Now, this is the key verses here in the whole of the book. He's saying simply this, don't think you'll get away. The king will find out you're one of us, and he'll kill you too. But God's going to say, and notice here, we don't see the name of God, but you hear it, don't you? When you read it. There's going to raise up one from the Jews who will deliver us. And then in verse 14, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Mordecai says, Esther, consider. Perhaps the whole reason that you were made queen is so that God would save not only you, but your people and your family. And so Esther responds. And Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. She says, here's what we're going to do. We're going to fast. Now, what always goes with fasting? Prayer, right? So we see here, again, it doesn't come up in the book, But this is the people who are going to pray, and they're going to fast, and they're going to seek the Lord's face over this matter for 3 days. He says, tell all the Jews to pray, and we're going to pray. And then I'm going to go before the king. And if he kills me, he kills me. Huh. You know, this is exactly what the handbell choir was talking about this morning. Right? Lord, here's my life. Body, soul, and spirit. I'm yours. And this is exactly what this young woman, probably in her 20s, is saying at this moment. I'm yours. Right? And if I die, I die. The courage of this young lady. I would pray that each of us would have the boldness and the courage to stand for the Lord like this young woman. To be able to go forth and speak boldly and courageously the truth of the gospel in a world that is certainly against it. If I perish, I perish, she says. I'm not going to read as much as I thought because we're going to run out of time. All right. So here's what's going to happen. Esther is going to go to the king. She's going to kind of walk in front of his throne room. And she knows, I can go here and he can say, you don't belong here, and you're dead. Or he can hold out the golden scepter and invite her in. So she does that. He holds out the golden scepter. He invites her in. He says, Esther, tell me what you want. Tell me what you want, and I'll give it to you. Well, there's an opportunity, right, for her just to say, here's what I want. But she doesn't. She says, instead, and this can only be the wisdom of God at this moment, to keep her from, at that moment, making her request. And so, instead of asking at that moment, she says, I'm going to make a feast for you and for Haman. Haman's the enemy, right? And so she invites him to the feast, and at the feast she prepares this wonderful meal for her husband, the king, and he says, Esther, tell me what you want, I'll give you anything. And she says, not tonight. Come back tomorrow night. I'll make another feast for you and Haman. Right? Now, in the meantime, what's going on with Haman? He's feeling really good about himself, right? He's been elevated to this prominent position by the king, and now the queen is inviting him to their personal feast. It's Xerxes and Haman and the queen. And he's going home and he's telling his family, look at me. You know, I'm in a good place here. And as he's going home to tell his family, he passes by Mordecai, and Mordecai refuses to bow down to him. And he's at this point thinking, there's nobody more important than me, and he still won't bow down. I'm going to kill him. And his family says, kill him. He builds the gallows to hang him on that very night. Now, that very night, in chapter 6, we see the intervention of God himself. Right? Because in chapter 6, look at verse 1. On that night, the king could not sleep. Just so happened, right? And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? The king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, Haman is there, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? You know what Haman's thinking, right? That's me, right? He wants to honor me. So Haman comes up with this great plan to dress him in the king's robes and parade him through the streets and say, this is the man who the king wants to honor. And then when he's finished, the king says, that's what I want you to do for Mordecai. Right? Do you see the hand of God working here? Oh, they were enemies, and Haman was the enemy of God. He was the enemy of the people of God. And so Haman does exactly that. He goes home and he whines to his family, and his wife literally says, if you're wanting to kill a man who is Jewish, it's not happening. She knows the history. God has preserved his people again and again and again. And so when it comes to the next night and the feast, right, at this point, Haman's thinking, okay, well, that didn't work out so well for me, but I still have my position, right? I just have to kind of forget my plan. But when they sit down to dinner, Xerxes asks Esther what? What can I give you? What do you want? And at this point, she says, let's read it together here, right? Verse 3 of chapter 7, then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen, and the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. All right. Haman's done. Right? But there's still a problem. So what's the problem? There was an edict that was sent forth out of the whole land, signed by the king, that says, on this day, all the Jews are going to be killed. And so Esther says, Xerxes, I'm thankful Haman's gone, but we have a problem. Right? You signed this law, and it's going to happen. It's an unalterable, unchangeable law. And Xerxes says, I can't change it. God's going to raise Mordecai to the second in command, Haman's place. And Xerxes literally says to Mordecai, Mordecai, you write the law that will save your people. And he's going to do exactly that. He says, on the day that the people are supposed to kill the Jews, you give them the right to defend themselves. You give them the right, and I'm going to support that. And he's going to send it out over the whole land. And on that day, what was supposed to be the annihilation of the Jews turns out to be a great victory. And we see that play out in chapter 8 and chapter 9. God saves and rescues his people. And we come to the theme of the book in chapter 9. I want you to see it here. Verse 24 of chapter 9, for Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, cast loss, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on its own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. You say, what do you mean? What's the theme there? Haman cast lots, right, to determine the day the Jews would be annihilated. But Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 33, it says what? The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. You know who was in control of that luck? God himself. God was the one who was in control. And that's the theme. The theme of the book of Esther is the sovereignty, the providence of God. His invisible hand is evident everywhere. Matthew Henry said this, though the name of God be not in it, the finger of God is, directing many minute events for the bringing about of his people's deliverance. when you're reading this book, if you don't know the end, I mean, if you didn't watch the VeggieTale movie, then you don't know, right? And it looks hopeless. But God moves to rescue and redeem his people. This is the whole book really is the Romans 8:28 of the Old Testament, right? All things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Are there things that happen in our life that we don't understand, that don't make sense to us? Sure, absolutely. What I want you to see is that God is working, God is orchestrating events in our lives to accomplish his purpose. And his purposes are good. That doesn't mean everything's always going to be what you want it to be. But isn't there great encouragement in knowing that we have a God who's in control, that's on the throne? And that's what we see here in the book of Esther. Not only do we see a God who is sovereign, we also see a God who is faithful. A God who is faithful to keep his promises. God had made a promise to Abraham. God made a promise to Moses. He made a promise to David. And he kept his promise in spite of the faithlessness of his people. When we are faithless, when we are not faithful, he is faithful. In fact, Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." We have a God who we can count on, who we can rely on. And we see that here in the book of Esther. The people of God are on the brink of destruction, and God providentially moves to rescue them in a way that nobody would expect. He takes a little orphan girl and raises her to a position of a queen who will intercede on behalf of God's people and rescue them. We also see the justice of God. God always punishes his enemies. Always. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord. The enemy of God's people we see in Esther is Haman, right? But the enemy of God's people is an enemy of God. Haman plotted to destroy not only Mordecai, but the entire Jewish race. And yet what? Haman died on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai. And all those who tried to follow through on Haman's plan died trying to kill and wipe out the Jews. I think it's important we remember that apart from Jesus Christ, the scripture says that we are enemies of God. Romans chapter 5 verse 10 says we're at enmity with him. In our sin, apart from faith in Jesus Christ, we're an enemy of God. God always punishes his enemies. If you're here and you've never put your faith and trust in Jesus Christ to save you, then you will experience God's wrath. We always say to look for Jesus in the scriptures. How do you find Jesus in a book that doesn't even mention God himself? Well, I think particularly we see it in this conflict between Haman and Mordecai. Right? We see this foreshadowing taking place. Haman plotting against the Jews to destroy them. But it was Satan himself who plotted against Christ and his people, right? To destroy, to wipe out. How did he do it? He tempted Christ in the wilderness. He opposed Christ even to the cross. And it's the very cross that Satan sought to use to wipe out Jesus Christ that God is going to use to what? To rescue and to redeem his people. We see the book of Esther. We see the sovereignty of God. We see his hand at work. And we're reminded that it was the very hand and sovereignty of God, we see it in Acts chapter 2, that put Jesus Christ on the cross, where he would crush Satan's head. God always defeats his enemies, and we are more than conquerors in him. We see this beautiful picture of encouragement tonight. Just reminding you, particularly tonight as the people of God, God has a plan and purpose for you. For your life. He's at work. His hand is at work in your life, even in the minor details. He's actively working to accomplish his purpose. And in response to a sovereign, faithful God, the only proper response is what? I'll give my all. Right? If I perish, I perish. I'm yours. I pray that would be the heart of us as his people tonight. That we would walk with him boldly, courageously, faithfully, that he may be glorified. And we're going to close in prayer.